artificial intelligence will completely transform our world. But what is AI? Why will it affect you? And how can you and your business survive and thrive through the AI revolution? Welcome to AI and You. Here is your host, author, speaker, and futurist, Peter Scott.
Hello, this is episode 213. You know, we don't use titles for guests here, otherwise half of them would be Dr. This or Professor That, and it would get repetitive. We're making an exception to that rule today because my guest's actual title is His Lordship, and that's a first for us. Lord Tim Clement-Jones is co-chair of the British All-Party Parliamentary Group on Artificial Intelligence, which he founded in 2016 with Member of Parliament Stephen Metcalfe. He is also former Liberal Democrat House of Lords spokesperson for Science, Innovation and Technology, and former chair of the House of Lords Select Committee on Artificial Intelligence, which reported in 2018 with, quote, AI in the UK, Ready, Willing and Able, and its follow-up report in 2020, AI in the UK, No Room for Complacency. In the interests of full disclosure, I gave evidence to the APPG AI in February 2020, which was their last in-person meeting in the House of Lords before they went online due to COVID, and Tim endorsed my most recent book, which has the same name as this show. However, he is here today because, 1, he has a new book out, and 2, I have seen many of the APPG AI's meetings over several years, and Tim and Stephen have impressed me as being extraordinarily well-informed and curious about AI, far more than any member of government in my experience, with the exception of Taiwan's Audrey Tang, who was our first guest. The book is called Living with the Algorithm, Servant or Master, AI Governance and Policy for the Future. And while it came out in the UK in March, its North American release date is July 18th. Tim was also the initiator of and subsequent member of the Special Inquiry Select Committee into AI in Weapons Systems, whose final report, Proceed with Caution, Artificial Intelligence in Weapon Systems, was published on December 1st, 2023. All this means that you are about to hear us cover an astounding array of topics from elections to employment, intellectual property to education, and much, much more. So let's get into the interview. Well, Lord Tim Clement-Jones, it is a pleasure to welcome you to AI and You. You are, of course, chair of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on AI, among many other things. But I'm thinking that it takes more than being a name at the top of a call sheet, even one as distinguished as that, to get out of bed and attack a subject like AI with the vigor and excitement that you have evidenced in it these many years now. So I'd like to know, what does this mean to you personally? What's driving you forwards?
Well, thank you, Peter. And it's a great pleasure to be with you today. It's really about the humans, to tell you the honest truth. I'm interested in the machines because of their impact on the humans. So where I come from is all about what are the opportunities of AI, but also what is going to be the impact on humans, whether it's in the workplace or in terms of creativity, whether it's in terms of substituting for them in employment or augmenting their working place experience. A whole series of questions which, for me, relate to, if you like, the future of humanity and our experience as humans, because I think AI probably has more profound implications even than things like electricity or the motor car or whatever it may be.
What do you see your role as in this effort on the global stage? What itch are you scratching?
Well, I suppose I'm a bit of an interpreter in a funny sort of way. I come from a professional background. I mean, I'm a lawyer by background, or a kind of recovering lawyer, I suppose I should say, because I've been in-house as a lawyer. I've been in private practice as a lawyer. I've been in government affairs as a lawyer, trying to interpret how you turn policy into legislation as a legislator in the Lords. So I've done a number of things, but a lot of this is about how to explain and how to show what the impact of something might be and what you do about it. So I suppose that's really where I come from. And it's why I set up the all-party group on AI, which you mentioned earlier, because frankly, you've got to start somewhere. And I thought that our politicians didn't know nearly enough about AI. And that was 8 years ago. And they still don't know very much, but we're working on it.
So what's your relationship to governance and regulation and legislation? Are you making laws, recommending laws? How do you see your role with respect to the end product of regulation of AI?
Well, I'm a tech optimist, and I'm also a regulatory optimist. There are a lot of people knocking around who say that regulation is the enemy of innovation, or they say, oh, you can't regulate, the technology is moving too fast, and so on and so forth. I believe, and I've had quite a bit of experience, 25 years in the House of Lords, and then latterly very much with digital legislation in terms of online harms, in terms of digital competition, data protection, a whole bunch of things involving, if you like, the virtual world, the internet, the digital world. So I think I'm reasonably well placed to guide people towards what I think is a kind of proportionate regulation. So, we're not coming down with a dirty, great hammer saying you can't do this and you can't do that. What we're trying to do is assess the kinds of risk involved and guide developers, adopters, consumers towards a point where they're adopting the technology in an ethical and a safe way, which is for the benefit of humanity, not a kind of rush into a technology because it's a great idea without knowing what the consequences are. So it probably sounds a little bit kind of Pollyanna-ish, but I do believe that regulation is meant to benefit us. It's not for the benefit of politicians or whatever. It's meant to drive things forward positively so that people then have the certainty in business to develop within certain guardrails, but also it gives consumers, if you like, the reassurance and the trust so that they know what to do and what's happening. And I think the two together really make sure that we can then, if you like, innovate with some confidence.
And your book, Living with the Algorithm, Servant or Master, clearly aimed at a mass audience, especially with a title like that. But when I was reading it, I couldn't help but feel that you were talking at me, but also to an audience around the world of lawmakers, policymakers, and people that could bend the needle on some kind of change with respect to how we live with AI. You certainly have the ears of those people more than just about anyone. What is it that you want them to do?
Well, I wanted, and that's why I've probably gone overboard with footnotes, but I wanted to really distill some of the important reports and lessons and then put them out there so that people would have no excuse for not seeing how to regulate, because there have been some brilliant reports internationally, nationally in the UK, been great organizations formed like the Global Partnership on AI, for instance, between Canada and France. The OECD is doing great work. There are UNESCO's doing great work. And yet, in a sense, there's so much happening out there that it's quite difficult, even for legislators with staffs, and heaven knows, US senators have staffs to dive for, but even they find it very difficult to keep up with the pace of development and analysis that is taking place. And so, for instance, when large language models came out about 18 months ago, big time, at the end of 2022, I think it was extraordinary. The world just took off and everybody started talking about large language models, generative AI, and it was as if AI had suddenly been invented. But of course it hasn't. And so I wanted to refer back to some of the earlier work as well, so that those people who had thoughtfully put out ideas about how to regulate and the risks involved of AI, whether predictive, generative, whatever you might describe it as, frontier, that their lessons, in a sense, were being learned. And there's an awful lot of good things out there. There are some great authors as well. I think of people like Cathy O'Neill talking about the power of the algorithm. I think about Stuart Russell with Human Compatible, talking about how do you get an AI system to, in a sense, behave in a way that's aligned to what humans want. Same with Brian Christian's book. There are quite a lot of books in the bibliography, if you like, which I wanted to unpack for people as well. Because, I've kind of lived, eaten and breathed this subject for quite some period of time. And there comes a point when you absolutely have to get it out of your brain and onto paper, quite honestly, and stop making endless speeches in the House of Lords and actually get out and engage properly in a book.
Well, I know the feeling about needing to get out of your head onto paper. And you mentioned the large language models there, and that was obviously a watershed moment because prior to that, very few people had a personal experience of AI. In my talks, I would encounter less than 10% of the audience had any experience of it whatsoever. Now it's 90%. And that meant I had to change half of my slides for one thing. But it has pushed AI out to the general population in terms of them having a direct experience of it. It has gone as viral and as mainstream as anything. And I wonder, when you experienced that, when you got your hands on those large language models, what went through your mind as you were exercising it?
Well, it was quite dramatic in many respects because it is giving humans a massive boost to their creativity. Now, that has downsides in terms of the risk of things like hallucination. It has downsides in terms of the way that some of these models have been trained, ingesting a great mass of copyrighted material, for instance. But actually, it's increasingly, in a sense, what I describe as retail use, the use by ordinary people, rather than wholesale, which is where corporates procure big systems. But it's like having an extra arm or leg or whatever it may be. It's giving power that we never had before in so many ways. And the productivity aspect for an individual when you use ChatGPT or Claude or Perplexity is a search engine that is quite extraordinary in its accuracy. And so you use these things and basically you're shortcutting a lot of work. You digest a report that gives you 15 key points and you then brood on those for a bit. You might go back to the original document, but you've got the essence of it, which means that you can start thinking about how to make use of that report and so on. Now, that's all very recent. I mean, so for instance, when I wrote my book, there weren't enough tokens, i.e. words that could be crunched by an LLM, whereas in the last 6 months, the number of tokens that a large language model can actually deal with is immense now. It could be, I don't know, I think the last count, it was probably something like 200,000, 300,000, maybe more. Every day that goes by, they become more powerful.
And as you say, these things happened in the last 6 months. And every 6 months now, AI is going through a radical reinvention. And how should regulators tackle something like that? It doesn't seem to me like any bureaucracy on earth can move fast enough to keep up. Do they need to try, or is there something new that they can do?
There is something new they can do because what we've done in 2019, as long ago as that, we had the OECD ethical principles. We had the G20, which adopted those principles. I mean, before then, I think my select committee, the one I chaired in the Lords in 2018 and reported, we called it AI in the UK, ready, willing and able, ? And it was all about government policy as to whether it was the right way forward. Well, we put forward 5 ethical principles, and there were many others floating around, the Asilomar Principles and so on. But it came to a head in 2019 really helpfully. And then, of course, we've now got the Hiroshima Principles as well in terms of large language models, generative AI. So we've got ethical principles to incorporate in our regulation if we so choose. That's what the EU chose to do. It's what the executive order in the States by Joe Biden's administration chose to do. It's probably the way forward. I suspect that Canada will be choosing, and we make lip service to it in the UK, but we haven't yet decided how to take that into regulation. But my view is whatever the regulatory framework, at the end of the day, incorporating those principles into standards. So, for instance, standards of risk assessment at the outset, standards of training. How do you train? What do you train? How transparent are you when you train? Testing. What kind of testing, red teaming, or whatever it is, should you employ? What kind of regular audit, continuous monitoring should you be undertaking for a high-risk model, and so on? There's a whole bunch of standards out there. Some of them are readily formed. You could take them off the shelf, 42001 from ISO, 42006, the former to do with risk assessment and so on. There are a whole bunch of things out there that you could pick off the shelf. And my goal and my encouragement to people like the OECD is to keep going and converge those standards if humanly possible. So let's get the National Institute for Standards and Technology in the States. Let's get the British Standards Institute. Let's get CEN-CENELEC in the European Union. Let's get them crunching these standards together, converging it so that business then, whatever the regulatory regime, has a pretty good idea of what they need to do. And the public can be reassured at the same time, and it's trust building.
Is this, and this being the topic of how to regulate AI or how to mediate and ameliorate the risks from AI, is it a fundamentally different thing for government bodies to deal with? It looks from the outside as though it is. I mean, nuclear weapons look easy by comparison because everyone can agree they don't want one to go off nearby. And yet with AI, there are factions wanting to go as fast as possible because of the enormous benefits that it will bring, and factions wanting to stop it because of the enormous risks that it will bring. How do you break down an approach to something whose negative effects literally run the gamut from loss of privacy to human extinction, and yet they have commensurate positive benefits ranging from recommending a Netflix movie to making humans immortal? Is that something that is a challenge unlike any that governments have faced before? How does it differ?
Yes, it is. It's a huge challenge. And that's why, in a sense, it's a circular argument, because we need regulation precisely for that reason. And we need risk assessment precisely for that reason. In the pyramidal way that the EU have come up with it, that is a very sensible approach. So you regulate less for low risk, you regulate more for high risk. That stands to reason. But in government, it's particularly important. And I quite agree about the nuclear weapons point, but we haven't even agreed by any form of international treaty that there should be no such thing as an autonomous nuclear weapons system. There is no international agreement on that specific. There is no agreement on what kind of autonomy, how much human involvement there should be in weapons systems. Now, people say, oh, well, look, if you start regulating, you're going to allow our enemies, those who are hostile actors, to develop their weapons systems, or indeed their ordinary AI systems at a faster rate than we are. Well, interestingly enough, China signed up, for instance, just to take China as an example, they signed up to the G20 principles many moons ago in 2019, and they have, in the private sector, the toughest form of regulation of large language models of anywhere in the world. So this nervousness about the power of AI is not something unique to the West. Now, obviously, we must treat Russia as a bit of a rogue state currently, but that position may not be the case forever and a day. And they were a member of the Council of Europe and so on. They were engaged on the Framework Convention on AI and Human Rights, which is now taking off and will be ratified probably this September by a huge number of European states. So I'm optimistic that actually it is possible to have a common goal. And this isn't just something that this woolly bunch in the West, so to speak, are keen on regulating, that actually this has such an impact on humanity and is potentially so important to us that it is something that a much wider group of nations needs to, in a sense, agree on how we regulate it.
You've talked a lot about risk management, and the risk management of AI is all over the place. There are effects happening now with impacts to privacy and employment. And then there are much larger impacts, more speculative, a decade off. And when we face a risk a decade away or more, then it seems like no one except government has the incentive to address that. And so it's especially disheartening to find out that government doesn't have the incentive either. A quote from your book that the 2021 House of Lords Special Inquiry into Risk Assessment and Risk Planning concluded that the UK National Risk Assessment System is heavily deficient in assessing and planning for chronic or long-term risks. And so is this a function of the interest or capriciousness of the electorate, or is there some other way that we should look to addressing that? And I'm thinking that, for instance, the longer-term universities like Oxford and Cambridge have long-term horizons by nature. Can we involve them somehow in this? How well are bodies like governments addressing long-term risk? And we could always look at climate change as a comparison.
Well, that's why I introduced that report into there. I mean, I sat on the committee myself, so I saw the full horror of our short-term non-planning, so to speak. And people crave stability. I mean, it's one of the reasons why our general election is a bit of a pushover for one particular party or two particular parties, because people are craving long-term stability. And we need a much longer-term approach. Now, the only people who can really deliver that are the institutions. And you talked about universities, absolutely right. But our civil service needs to absolutely have risk assessment front and center. And it has improved since our report. I mean, obviously, our report was a snapshot. We made recommendations, and it's quite gratifying to see some of those recommendations being taken up. But something like the existential risks of artificial general intelligence are just not there in terms of our planning. And you're quite right. That is a very important aspect. But of course, I want regulation that is about here and now risks as well as the existential risks. And one of my reasons for arguing for regulation now and basically having standards that apply so that we don't have bias in the systems, we don't have hallucinations, we don't have misinformation, disinformation, deep fakes, and so on, all that sort of side of things, is because we need to plan for the advent of artificial general intelligence. If we don't regulate now, by the time artificial general intelligence comes along, it'll be too late. There will be no guardrails. So this sort of setting up of AI safety institutes and all this kind of thing, that the results of the Bletchley Park meeting last year, I've got nothing against Bletchley Park, by the way. Both my parents met there. So, in fact, I've got some affection for it. But as a grandstanding form of PR, I thought the outcome was very, very disappointing. And the focus on AI safety alone, as opposed to the ethics of AI, was completely wrong. And the focus on existential risks by our government, as opposed to the here and now, again, was wrong. Some governments have started to correct that. South Korea, in their most recent summit, and they dropped the word safety. They just called it an AI summit. I was very pleased by that. And they've now started talking about a new digital bill of rights. Well, that, if you like, rights-centered form of AI regulation, I think is really important because it comes back to the humans again.
Talking about the existential risks, before 2023, anyone talking about existential risks got generally poo-pooed in the community. I mean, they even piled on Stephen Hawking and said, well, you're a theoretical physicist, not a computer scientist. You don't know what you're talking about. And only a few people whose reputation was unassailable, like Stuart Russell, could even get away with it. And yet then in 2023, we saw the letters calling for a pause or a moratorium. And people like Jeff Hinton quit Google so that he could speak directly about the existential threat. And they were not ambiguous about what they were talking about. I was quite surprised by this because I thought this is going to cause panic among the population and it will revive fantasies of Terminator robots. And it certainly seems to have caused a lot of activity. Did those letters and those calls, did they help? Did they hinder? Did they create alarmism, the wrong impression among the population? What did they do net?
I think net, it was neutral, sadly, because people thought it was a bunch of boffins. This is the general public. Somebody like Jeff Hinton, the inventor, if you like, of backpropagation and all this kind of stuff. I mean, towering figure in the world of AI development and so on. I took what he said really seriously. But of course, what he wasn't just saying is, it's all about existential risk. He is a proponent of regulation here and now. So in a sense, I didn't agree with the moratorium. I don't think those work really, apart from where you've got control, which is in government. I mean, for instance, I thought there always should be a moratorium on live facial recognition before we had proper legislation, and I still do. But I do believe that their call for a moratorium helped make the case for regulation here and now. The narrative around AI is, sadly, it's about 2,000 years old, strangely enough. And in the book, you probably noticed that I talk about sort of Greek myths and all this kind of thing. Well, we're inured to talking about aliens. We've talked about Frankenstein's creature. We've talked about the Prague golem, these creatures. And AI is an alien kind of intelligence in a way. If you've ever come across a recruitment AI, they're pretty cool characters, cold, without empathy, and we may have to get used to that kind of AI in the future. So I do accept some of the issues, but I also believe you have to push back against that negative narrative. There's an interesting expression called the uncanny valley, where embedded AI, where it's embedded in a robot, for instance, and it's too close to looking like a human being, you abreact as a human. Now, you've got all of that involved as well. So we've got to get over some of that. We've got to think a bit more like the Japanese, where we think these robots or whatever it may be, AI, is a more human-friendly approach or human-friendly entity, because Shinto has this belief that even rocks have spirits and so on. So they come from a very different culture in that respect, which I think is helpful as a way of understanding this. Doesn't mean that you don't have to regulate, but it means you don't start from a position of fear and total risk averseness. You've got to tackle risk. You can't just simply stand there frozen and think, oh my goodness me, we're in an existential spot here. The Terminator is arriving. And I agree with you to that extent. But there is no harm in having some public dialogue and unpacking something. But I think it's unhelpful really to arouse too much fear and suspicion in public.
Do you find a tension between what people would like to regulate and what is reasonably practical to regulate? I find people suggesting all the time that something should be done that is simply implausible. Some things are just beyond regulation. It's analogous to birds crossing international borders. You couldn't stop that if you wanted to. Some genies have already escaped from the bottle. We are not going backwards on AI. That is not possible. And then there are some that might yet escape from the bottle but haven't so far. Things that we could imagine, for instance, will certainly be possible when we get better hardware, and we can draw a curve on a graph and see when that better hardware is coming, that faster, more efficient hardware. Enormous amounts of money being spent on that. I don't know if that means that we should try and strictly regulate the development and production of advanced hardware as a way of limiting AI development. What are your thoughts on genies and bottles?
Yes, I think there are definitely some trade-offs here. I think, for instance, with intellectual property regulation, we are kind of regulating as the horse is bolting. Because if you look at the large language models and what they've trained on, they've already trained on hundreds of thousands of copyrighted works, music, writing, images, and so on. And they haven't paid for their licenses. Now, obviously, going forward, there's benefit. The news organizations are getting their act together, and the large language model developers are licensing material from them, and so on and so forth. So just recognition of IP rights, I think, is good. But there are some trade-offs. I mean, for instance, there are some areas, like I've been working on online safety legislation, and where you're dealing with very sensitive areas like freedom of expression, and you're talking about the way the algorithm amplifies messages and so on, what is disinformation, what is misinformation. There are nuances there and basic rights, which are very, very difficult to tiptoe through in terms of getting the regulation right and the risk assessment right for AI. So, yeah, in some areas, like social media and the use of algorithms there, it's not easy. But in other areas where, for instance, they're in the workplace, where they're being recruitment or performance management, or in government, for instance, in terms of how Social Security uses them, live facial recognition, which I've mentioned, automated decision-making by government departments. There are all kinds of areas where we should be making sure that we have proper standards applied, that have transparency, we have registers of use by government, and so on, all without actually inhibiting the development where they're for our benefit. But the purpose of transparency and explainability is we need to be convinced that they're for our benefit. Stephanie Hare's written a lovely book with the title Technology is Not Neutral. And I entirely agree with her, basically. And she unpacks that thesis.
You mentioned intellectual property there. You're a lawyer, so I want to toss you this one. Put your lawyer hat on. Because human beings train themselves on copyrighted works too. Far fewer copyrighted works than generative AI does. No one objects to that. And so why then the double standard in saying that we are going to limit what AI can be trained on instead of applying the substantial similarity test, for instance, to what it produces? And imagine this argument coming to a head in a court somewhere. How do you think it plays out?
Well, of course, it is going to come to a head in a court somewhere. Getty is making sure all over the world, I think, that it's particularly in the UK and the US, that it is testing these issues. Well, it's partly because it is a machine and he's not a human seeking inspiration. A human is not copying it into their brain. They are looking at a Van Gogh and getting inspiration from it. It's a different process. So you can equate a deep neural network with a human brain, but it's actually not the same. The process of assimilation and training is very different. These are used to train. And then, of course, the test is on the output as to whether the output is original or not. But we are talking about, in the human mind, is inspiration rather than copying. So I'm afraid I'm going to be quite lawyerish in response to that by saying, sorry, Gov, this is a different set of I would distinguish the case, as they say in court.
But you can imagine that that battle will happen, that it's not going to be a walkover.
No, it's not going to be a walkover. But interestingly enough, OpenAI and Anthropic and people like that, they have agreed to license material from the big news publishers, News Corp and the Financial Times, I think the Washington Post or the New York Times, I'm not sure which one, but they're all busy signing up licensing agreements with the big AI developers, which I think is a very good sign, even though I'm afraid quite a lot of the horses got out of the stable.
Oh, well, counsel for plaintiff would argue that that meant that they already recognized that they wouldn't have a case with respect to arguing that only substantial similarity should apply.
Well, that people like Anthropic and so on wouldn't have a case. No, It's an admission, really, that copyright subsists.
That's the end of the first part of the interview. We'll have the rest next week. You heard there a perfect demonstration of the kind of guest that I aim to get on this show. I get emails all the time from company PR flacks wanting their CEO to come on the show to talk up their gee-whiz product. We don't do that. I don't want anyone on the show whose real answer to the question, what's driving you forwards, would have something to do with market share, competitiveness, or monetization. And if you've seen Tim in action, which you can do in the YouTube channel for the Big Innovation Center, and looking in their videos for the AI APPG sessions, which are over an hour each, you can see how much this topic matters to him and how much energy he's bringing to making a difference about it. And that provided a fascinating perspective to us here because we heard from someone wearing a very big hat with about as big a perspective on what to do about AI as anyone could have. In today's news, ripped from the headlines about AI, a study by scholars at Harvard Business School, MIT Sloan School of Management, the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania, and the University of Warwick studied the effects of generative AI on the work of consultants at the firm BCG. The findings are quite illuminating. For instance, they discovered a paradox. People seem to mistrust the technology in areas where it can contribute massive value, and to trust it too much in areas where the technology isn't competent. In an equally impactful discovery, when using generative AI, in this case GPT-4, for creative product innovation, a task involving ideation and content creation, around 90% of the participants improved their performance. What's more, they converged on a level of performance that was 40% higher than that of those working on the same task without GPT-4. People best captured this upside when they did not attempt to improve the output that the technology generated. Interesting. Now, creative ideation sits firmly within Gen AI's current frontier of competence. But when the participants used the technology for business problem solving, a capability the researchers describe as outside that frontier, they performed 23% worse than those doing the task without GPT-4. And even participants who were warned about the possibility of wrong answers from the tool did not challenge its output. This kind of research is really important to our learning of how to extract value from generative AI. We've been in an insane gold rush for a year and a half while the hype bucket overfloweth. A huge number of very loud people are making unbounded claims about AI, because the more they claim, the more attention they get, and they can monetize that attention. All this is going to turn into a backlash at some point when people discover that the truth includes statistics, like those 23% of study participants who were worse using AI than without it. We need to get clear, rational, unbiased information about what AI is actually doing and capable of. And that's the currency we deal in on this show. So if you want more people to join in, please do give us a 5-star rating and positive review on your podcasting platform. I promise you that every one of them helps. Next week, we'll conclude the interview with Lord Tim Clement-Jones, when we'll talk about elections, including the one just held in the UK, and disinformation, what AI and robots do to the flow of capital, the effects of AI upon education and enterprise culture, privacy and making AI accountable and trustworthy. Phew! All that is next week on AI and You. Until then, remember, no matter how much computers learn how to do, it's how we come together as humans that matters.
That's all for this episode of AI and You. Please leave a rating and comment and share with your friends. Get the book Artificial Intelligence and You and see more videos and articles at aiandyou.net. That's aiandyou.net, where you can also send us your questions. Thank you for listening.